I was wondering, I've got an iPhone, iPad, Mac, and the same thing, and I've noticed that I don't use the phone much now when you've got an iPad. I take this instead of a laptop because it's lighter. The battery lasts all day. This battery is terrible. And if I'm traveling, I use the iPad. So to what extent is actually the smartphone as a category going to evolve into something bigger that you carry with you that does all your computing as well?
I have a similar feeling in terms of the iPad, and it's kind of a new device, and there are other tablets coming out. If I could only carry one device, you have to carry the phone, unfortunately. Well, because people still like to phone you occasionally. And I don't know why the iPad, if you've got the 3G modem card in it, why they switch messaging off.
Perhaps it's to stop you.
Well, that is an interesting point. Who had the very first generation RIM Blackberries when they came to this country? Exactly. You know, they could do a data connection and they switched all the voice and the messaging off as well. It had the same modem in. You know, it's got a radio stack in it. It can do these things. All you need is the UI. But they didn't want to get in the way of anybody else's phone sales, so they didn't put the whole thing together. And that was Rick Costanzo of RIM, who came over from Canada to launch it in Europe. And that must have been 2000. So we've gone 11 years on, and Apple are doing the same thing with an iPad. If you get a 3G modem in it, and there was should you buy it with the 3G or not? Everybody else on my team bought it without 3G, and I bought the 3G. And they carry their phones with them because they have to tether it to something when they're out and about. So they got two phones, and you're right, they put the phone over there, and then they use their iPad, and I just use the iPad. There will always be a hierarchy of device capabilities and what you're willing to carry at any one time in terms of functionality. I wouldn't carry my iPad if I was going out to dinner with my wife. I could do, but it would be very rude and really wouldn't have been seen very good light. So I would recommend my iPhone, but it's a case of I would now use my iPhone when I don't have my iPad. And almost everything else that I want to do from an internet point of view, I'd rather have my iPad. If I sit in the living room and the television's on, the other I answer this better than I can. There are other strands that people do. They now have laptops and computers and tablets with them while they watch television. And something will come on the screen, and then you'll look it up, or you'll get a message from somebody, and you'll see it on the screen. So I'll always do that with my iPad. I don't do it with my laptop anymore, and I don't know where my phone is, and I think it's in the charger somewhere else in the house. So I'll agree with you. Things are morphing around still, but an iPad is that big. When you've got something that big, would you swap to that instead? I don't know.
Genevieve, how important, how profound is the change in behaviour now that we do have all these devices surrounding us all the time?
I mean, I think what's been most interesting is if you actually track the data and you look back, at some of the devices you were showing, right? And there was always sort of a persistent notion, particularly in the tech press, that we were going to go to a single device, right? There is this kind of, so just tell me what device I need to carry, and it's the only thing, right? Just the one thing. And what's really clear when you look at normal consumers, and I don't mean this as an insult, but none of you in this room reflect the general public. And in fact, most of your technology habits will be statistically deviant. No comment on what you're actually doing, but you just, your usage patterns don't look normal, and what's more to the point, they're also not where the population is moving. So I think, one of the challenges we often have at Intel is that our leadership team are highly technically oriented, they like technology, they're early adopters, they're relatively wealthy. Their orientation to technology doesn't look like the rest of the population. It's also not the destination that the rest of the population is moving to. So I think one of the interesting things is that rather than that rhetoric of people constantly questing for the one device, what we actually see is people continuing to not just make do with lots of devices, but willingly choose to have lots of devices because they perform very different functions. iPads and laptops, good on sofas when you are in fact watching television. You don't actually want to necessarily take them to dinner, to clubs. There are remarkable arguments in most of the households we've studied about what you can bring to bed with you in terms of device formats, unsurprisingly. But, I think, for most consumers, what's been most interesting from where we sit is watching how people talk about these things. I mean, I think it was fascinating to watch the evolution of the phone there. And in realizing in your question, one of the things that I'm most struck by is the fact that I think the experience people now have of those mobile devices, and I think it expands from phones to tablets. It's not about making calls anymore. The calls are a secondary and incidental thing. They're important when you're doing micro-coordination of kids and jobs and objects and of destinations. There's a bit of sort of social family work that goes on of, yes, she's fine. No, I'm not coming to dinner, that piece of work. But when we look at the experience that those objects are really serving, I actually think it's moved from being one of communication to one of ensuring that you'll never be bored anywhere you go. And there's something really interesting if you imagine that what the mobile form factor is now about is forestalling boredom, not about communication per se. And when you look at the kind of things we do with handsets and indeed with tablets, I think there's a very strong argument that one of the principal experiences they deliver to human beings is this ability to never have to be somewhere without something to do. And, they've replaced, as certain other things have disappeared that we used to do in small fragments, cigarettes and newspapers principally. What we now have is social games, apps that we download and keep for a week, use repeatedly, and then move on to the next one. Micro-location stuff, very small doses of activity. And I think there's something really interesting if you start to imagine that what those form factors are providing is not actually communication, but an ability to be constantly, if not engaged, certainly not bored.
Yes. I do remember actually when I spoke to a handset manufacturer quite a few years ago about mobile games, and they said, the most important thing mobile games is not have a big game, but just to have something you could do at the bus stop. I said, yeah, like that's something that's important. And of course, it turns out yet again I was wrong. It is really important. Yes, we have a question there at the back.
Hi, thanks. Genevieve, just coming back to your data presentation earlier, I'd like your views on the value of data. I heard an interesting anecdote recently that in an incredibly price-sensitive environment, millions of consumers are willing to pay a real dollar on a virtual tractor in Farmville, and just how that environment is changing the way that we interact and value data.
Yes, explain Farmville. I'm sure I don't understand it either.
Well, that would be another one of the ones about which you were wrong, you see.
Yeah, it would actually,
Yeah.
yes.
So Farmville exists in the category of what used to be called casual games and are now called social games. What's most interesting about them, like a whole other sort of space of technology that we don't often talk about, is that somewhere between 60 to 75% of all players on casual games, but in particular things like Farmville, happen to be women, mostly in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And they're twice as willing as their male counterparts who play massive multiplayer games to actually spend money in the virtual world, real money in the virtual world. I think what we're seeing there, and there's a couple of threads that I think are interesting. One is that Apple in particular has really proved out the business model that says consumers are willing to pay small incremental amounts for small incremental experiences. So rather than saying you need to have a subscription model that says I'm going to put this amount of money down in advance about the experiences I plan to have this month, we're willing to in fact say, no, I'll pay $1 for this, 99 cents for this, 50 cents for this, $2 for this. And when we've actually tracked, and I know that people who also track this data more broadly, people are actually paying more money that way than they would if they'd had a subscription, but it feels less painful. So there's a piece about the paying for experiences and paying for data that is in fact this incremental approach where it's become part of the way we think about just being in the world. And when you track in Western countries, so sort of emerged markets, if you track discretionary spend over the last about 3 years, what's really interesting is the piece of discretionary spending that is the communication and information technologies bundle has moved down the stack from being discretionary to being a necessity. And where people have made decisions about what else they'll sort of take out of their lives, what they have chosen to keep and see as being more fundamental is now mobile phone bills, television and cable subscriptions, and the internet. And in fact, what we've seen as people have restricted their income down and restricted their spending is that one of the places they have reprioritized around is all these services. And that's actually become no longer seen as being a discretionary spend as it was 5 years ago, but is now seen as just being the cost of being in the world. So you've got those two facts, right? One is that we now treat it like buying coffee or a newspaper. You kind of shell it out on a regular basis, but erratically. And then I think to your last question, Graham, about where the conversions are between the virtual and the real. We've seen some interesting stuff in the data. We have about whether consumers are willing to trade off access to their personal data for a price reduction. So, I will give you as my service provider this personal information about my profile in return for which you'll give me cheaper content. What was interesting there was just how much consumers imagined their service providers already knew about them. So we spend a lot of time in the industry worrying about privacy and thinking consumers worry about it too. And the answer was that consumers just assumed that everyone from their mobile phone companies to their banks to the people who gave them TV service already knew everything about them that we would worry about. They assumed they knew household income, age, gender of household residents. What they were much more concerned about disclosing to their service providers was what they were actually doing with the services. So we'd been listening to consumers worry about this. And we're like, well, you know, we can make life easier for you. We will just pre-populate your Facebook page and your tweets with what you're watching on television and what websites you're on. Because you've said you always do that, right? We'll just take care of that for you. And in 5 different countries, age and gender irrespective, consumers went, please don't. And we started pushing on it and discovered that, you know, it was precisely because consumers would say things like, well, but my set-top box wouldn't know I was watching that show ironically. Okay. Or, I only watched that show because my girlfriend's here, but you broke up with her. Yeah, but the show's still on. So there was this really interesting way that, in fact, what we watched and what we consumed became another way of varnishing our self-presentation, and we didn't want to have it automated. So there were some interesting places where we were not willing to trade off our personal data because of what it ultimately revealed about us.
Ed, looking through the history of smartphones, there was always that thing that smartphones were very serious things for very serious people.
Yep.
You know, that idea that there were a category of phone users that did useful things and a category of phone users that just messed about. And they had different phones that were pink or green or that sort of thing. And now they sort of come together in that sort of thing. Is that, you know, was that the mistake? Well, you know, thinking back all the time you've been in the business, was that always the assumption that there was serious stuff and there was messing about stuff and they were separate?
I think there was a lot of misunderstanding about what people want to buy, even from someone like Carphone and the distribution. And it was a very serious tool in the first, you know, Carphone. It sold car phones to businessmen for large sums of money. But then they sold it on top of that of, we only employ graduates and they can give you really, really detailed technical advice about what's right to buy for you. And you can buy every phone from every operator from our shop, so you get a massive range of information. And then they did one advert, or they did a co-sponsorship deal in one of a girls' magazine or a woman's magazine, and they just said, here's a pink carry bag with a pink phone on one tariff, on one operator. It's like, there's no choice, there's just this, but it's pink. And I think they sold sort of 50,000 off 1 month's, my God, you know, it was the first bit I remember listening to them in the retail going, you know, we sold a lot more by not offering any choice than we do than offering choice here. And a lot of things like that started to switch around. They did, when the Motorola Razr came out, again, I think Carphone did the exclusive on the pink version of it. You could only get the pink one from, and they sold shitloads of it. You know, they were dragged off to the Motorola, you know, Motorola employee show and say, you know, we sold 2 million. Yay! You know, why? Because we restricted it to one color. So there is now a lot about fun, but I still think from a handset point of view, people who are buying them now, they kind of have peer pressure and peer understanding about what sort of phone they should buy. And if you haven't got a smartphone, then you really are in trouble from, you know, your peer group. But you don't necessarily know what it does. No. So it is still fun, really, for now.
However, you do know that you can connect it to your company's IT network and get stuff on it, which sometimes for fun phones, as we found out on the reg, isn't always good news. You know. Now, is there... yes, there's a question in the middle there.
Thanks. It's a couple of questions for Ed. Firstly, more an observation. I was just surprised to see HP in your list of agile movers in the smartphone market. Perhaps you could just sort of explain why. And then secondly, just you talked about how the operating systems are all very antiquated and there's not, you know, a great deal of innovation there. I had sort of read things here and there about HTML5 and how going forwards that could be a sort of common platform for smartphones and kind of making the underlying operating system less relevant, and perhaps that's some sort of converged operating system, if you like, for smartphones in the future. Just wondered if you had any views on that.
I put HP on there for two reasons. One, because of obviously WebOS, which is they have aspirations in the space. And they know it's important for them. At some points, some people can kind of see a new market opportunity and run for it ahead of the pack. I think Microsoft is probably the best at it. We'll see somebody who seems to be running really fast and will run along really just behind them, waiting to see what happens, and then can take the opportunity as a fast follower. I think HP kind of torn between two, which is they could move really fast and quickly and put a lot of money into it, but they don't quite know what they're doing. but they could see at some point or other they must be getting their own user surveys back that come and say, I don't do it on a computer anymore, I do it on my phone. Or I don't do it on a computer anymore, I do it on my tablet. And if they're not in that market, and the market for PCs disappears, they're either going to shrink or they're just not going to grow. So they've got enough cash, they've got enough bits of the infrastructure that if they wanted to do something, they could. They just seem to be a bit too timid about going for it. That, and they haven't quite figured out this whole ecosystem thing. They think if you do a tablet and provide no services around it, that's acceptable. And it's just not anymore. That's on one side of it. The other one on HTML5, I think we drank that Kool-Aid last year in my company, and we said we won't do native operating system apps. We'll try and do it as an HTML5 app and see what happens. And it was really painful in terms of an experience. It ought to be good, and it will be at some point, but in the time when it's getting really good, I don't know how much better all the native experiences will become. So I think we adopted a dual strategy, which is for the really big usage platforms, we'll go native, and for everything else, we'll go HTML5 and get an experience which should be acceptable, and at least we get some code replacement. And it marries effort to the reward.